changing lives for Native people. With its new province, growing cities, and swelling population, Canada seemed a place of expanding horizon. Yet for some, Canadian horizon were shrinking. Only one generation before, many Native people had moved freely across land that had always been theirs. By the early 20th century, more and more land was being surveyed and settled by immigrants, or mapped and claimed by mining or on government officials. Most Native people were being moved onto land reserved for them, as well as being pushed into reserve. Native people continued to be pushed to the margin of Canadian society. The Indiana Act of 1876 and 1895 were designed to encourage Native people to give up their own culture and tradition and assimilate into become part of the mainstream Christian English and French-speaking culture of Canada. Native people could not earn a university degree or become lawyers, doctors, or minister and still be considered status Indians, eligible for benefits under the Indian Act. Government, churches, and many individuals believed that education would help Native people adapt to the changing world. Many Native children were sent to residential schools, which were often located a long way from their homes. These schools were often run by Christian organizations that believed that Native children had to be saved by becoming Christian. The children were not allowed to use their own language or to practice any of their beliefs. Sometimes they were abused. Treatment of Aboriginal people. During the 1930s, Canada Aboriginal people were often treated badly. Condition in many Native and Métis communities that were already difficult before the Depression now became much worse. Relief authorities tended to assume that all Native people could live off the land. This may have been true for some groups and individuals, but others had long abandoned a hunting-gathering economy. Moreover, in the Prairie province, Native people were sometimes persecuted when they tried to live off the land. These provinces had claimed jurisdiction over natural resources in 1930, ignoring Aboriginal tradition and Native rights under the federal law. The Prairie province began to change Native people who hunted and fished on government property. Rights for Aboriginal women. In the 1970s, an issue of equality between Aboriginal men and women came before the court. The case dealt with the status of women under the Indian Act. Klaus stated that Aboriginal women who married a non-Aboriginal man forfeited her right to be considered an Indian under the Indian Act. As a result, she could no longer live or inherit reserved property. In 1970, there was an issue. Janet Corbia, an Aboriginal woman, married David Lavelle, a non-Aboriginal man. When she was informed that her marriage meant that she would lose her Aboriginal status, Mrs. Lavelle brought action against the government. She claimed that the law violated her rights to equality since an Aboriginal man maintained Indian status no matter whom he married. When Mrs. Lavelle lost her case, she appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada and won. Her victory, however, was short-lived. The Aboriginal community challenged the Supreme Court decision, arguing that it is not the one that should be made by a white court. In 1973, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 against Mrs. Lavelle's claim. Sandra Levis, an Aboriginal woman, faced a similar loss of her right in 1979. She took her case to the United Nations Committee on Human Rights. She was supported by the UN, but the Canadian government did not act to change the law until 1985. Mary 2 acts early was the first woman to have her Native status restored. Canada's Aboriginal peoples' frustration and protest. Frustration continued to grow in 1980s and 1990s. In Aboriginal communities, rates of poverty, violence, addiction, suicide, and poor education in many First Nation communities were appalling. 25% of Aboriginal people were unemployed in 1991. 29% received a social assistance in 1991. suicide rates were 3 times the Canadian average. Aboriginal people were frustrated by their living condition and by government failures to honor treaties and settle land claims. To Aboriginal people, treaty right and land claim included the right to control resources on the land being claimed, including fishing, hunting rights. The Canadian and provincial governments were not willing to give such rights automatically. Even when government wanted to redress serious wrong done to Aboriginal people, solutions were often not simple. In many cases, land governed by broken or forgotten treaties or not governed by any treaty had been used for farming, recreational purposes for a generation by non-natives. Often, non-Aboriginal Canadians in good faith had bought and built homes and businesses on land that were later claimed by Aboriginal people. In some cases, Aboriginal people successfully challenged the right of provinces to control when they could fish or hunt. Some non-Aboriginal Canadians have resented these rulings. In the 1980s and the 1990s, Aboriginal people across Canada organized, protested in growing numbers. In maritime, they challenged provincial hunting, fishing regulation on land they claim as their own. In Ontario, Aboriginal people and environmentalists joined forces to oppose logging near Tamagami. Breakthroughs in 1970s. Although the issues of Native rights and status were not resolved in the 1970s, there were important breakthroughs. A wider definition of the term Aboriginal rights was emerging. A process of dealing with land claims was in place, and confident declaration of rights had been proclaimed. Governments were beginning to recognize the necessity of fair negotiations with Native people on proposed development that affected them. Declaration of the First Nation. There is 8 points to that one. We, the original peoples of this land, know the Creator put us here. Second one, the Creator gave us laws that govern all our relationships to live in harmony with nature and mankind. Third, the laws of the Creator define our rights and responsibilities. Fourth, the Creator gave us our spiritual beliefs and languages, our culture, a place on Mother Earth which provides us with all needs. Fifth, we have maintained our freedom, our languages, and our traditions from time immemorial. Sixth, we continue to exercise the right and fulfill the responsibility, obligation given to us by the Creator for the land upon which we were placed. 7. The Creator has given us the right to govern ourselves and the rights to self-determination. 8. The right and responsibility given us by the Creator cannot be altered or taken away by any other nations. These are the 8 things the First Nations believe in. The Aboriginal rights and land claims. The term Aboriginal rights was coming to use at the time of the white and red paper debates. The term was applied specifically to the land claim that is Native people claims to property. The new office of the Native land claim dealt with 2 kinds of claim. Number 1, specific land claim based on treaties and the Indian Act. Number 2, comprehensive land claims based on traditional use and occupancy. As Aboriginal rights became more clearly recognized, Native people began to submit hundreds of land claims to the Office of Native Land Claims. During the 1970s, Native people widened their concept of Aboriginal right to include nationhood, self-government. A new image of the status of Canada's Native people began to emerge. This status was expressed in the Declaration of the First Nation adopted by the Joint Chiefs and Elders in 1975. The reaction of Native organization caused Trudeau government to withdraw the white paper in 1971. During the rest of the 1970s, the federal government funded programs to support communication, cultural activity, and local government among Native people. As well, the government created the Indian Claims Commission in 1969 and Office of Native Claim in 1974 to deal with the issue of land rights. Yet overall, in the 1970s, federal government was less generous spending on the native people than on general populations. Dissatisfied with the government's minimal policies, the NIB stepped up its media and lobbying efforts. As well, other organizations appeared and took on more active roles. For example, the Canadian Indian Youth Council, the Canadian Native Communication Society, and the National Native Women's Association of Canada. Changing terms. In the first half of the 20th century, the following terms were used to refer Aboriginal people, Indian, and Métis. In the second half of the 20th century, the following terms were used: Native people and Aboriginal peoples. Aboriginal people is the term used most commonly today. Aboriginal people refer to Inuit, Métis, First Nation, legally defined Indian nation consisting of status Indian and non-status Indians. The term Indian is used only when referring legislation, the Indian Act in historical sense, the National Indian Brotherhood, or when referring to legal status. In 1990s, First Nation came to be used in place of Indian Band or Indian Nation. You should note this down that status Indian are those who have legal rights under the Indian Act. They have rights under treaties or where no treaties have been signed. Rights as registered Indians. Non-status Indians are those who have given up their native legal status while still retaining their cultural identity. Natives' rights. A group of Canadians that probably felt the sting of intolerance that most was not immigrant group. It was Canada's Native people. In 1946, the federal government created a committee made of members of the House of Commons and the Senate to consider changes to the Indian Act. In the hearing, which lasted until 1948, the committee learned the difficulty that many Aboriginal people faced. Aboriginal incomes were often a fraction of those of others Canadian, and living conditions to reserve were often appealing. His government suggested that the Indiana Act should be eliminated and the Native people be given the same rights as the other Canadians. Native response to the proposal was immediate negative. The National Indiana Brotherhood, NIB, formed original as North American Brotherhood in 1947 to speak for Treaty Indianas. Led the fight. Native people, the NIB argued, did not want the same thing as the rest of Canada. They want self-government to maintain their culture. The stage was set for a struggle of the next 3 decades. So basically, the Indiana wanted to be native, NIB, they wanted to be special than all the others so they can celebrate with their tradition. But Justin Trudeau Trudeau wanted everyone to be equal. So he resigned. They were fighting for 3 decades. Because Trudeau wanted everyone to be treated equally. The White Paper. In the 1960s, Native leaders made it clear that traditional rights, for example, to hunt and fish year-round and land claims had been top priorities for federal government. Yet in 1969, the Trudeau government prepared a policy document known as the White Paper that ignored these priorities. Trudeau recommended measures designed to achieve integration and equality with other Canadians, just as he opposed Quebec independence. Trudeau opposed the isolation of Native peoples from the rest of Canada. The White Paper proposed the elimination of Department of Indian Affairs, Indiana status, traditional rights, and treaty right. The Native has been fighting for this right for 3 decades, and now they have lost their rights to hunt, fish, and whatever they do. Trudeau is being fair by everyone having the same right, and everyone respond to white paper. The native respond quickly to this white paper, to the native rights. Native people founded a new organ to protest against their side. They were called the NIB, as we know is stand for Native Indian Brotherhood. The NIB was created to fight for the native rights. The Indian Association of Alberta issued its own red paper in response to Trudeau's white paper. The red paper argued that Native people must retain their distinct culture. It is also called for political economic power at the community level, and for millions of dollars of spending to provide Native people with social service that equaled those provided to the rest of Canada. The report stated that Native people needed to be noticed as Citizen Plus.